So I just watched the third episode of X-Men 97, and Mr. Sinister may be one of the most terrifying Marvel villains I've ever seen. We're gonna get into the breakdown and talk about my thoughts on this episode, but I have to be transparent in saying this is my first actual introduction into Mr. Sinister as a character. I didn't really grow up with the X-Men, nor was I watching the 90s cartoon, so this is my first real exposure to this character, and what a first introduction this was. And before we get started with this video, if you guys could leave a like and a comment down below on what you thought about this episode, I'd really appreciate it. I read every single one. I most likely will respond, and let's get into the breakdown. So at the end of the last episode, we saw Jean Grey arrive at the X-Mansion, but the problem was there already was a Jean Grey. We find out that the Jean Grey who walked through the door at the end of the last episode in fact was the real Jean Grey, and the person that Cyclops has had a baby with was in fact a clone. This is taken directly from the comics. This clone of Jean is actually named Meline Prior, a clone made by Mr. Sinister himself. That way Meline Prior could have a baby with Cyclops and then eventually create Cable. But obviously Mr. Sinister wants this child for himself, but clearly the future and the past, I guess, tells us that this person, Nathan Summers, turns out to be Cable. So everyone's freaking out, and especially the clone Meline Prior, who isn't named that at this moment, but will be later on in the episode. She believes that she is the real Jean Grey and goes into a complete existential crisis, causing some mass confusion and Mr. Sinister to make his move. While alone with her child, we hear a creepy voice from the baby monitor. And this is terrifying. It really reminded me of Insidious, because there's a scene in that movie where a baby monitor starts talking. I love that movie. It's like my favorite scary movie of all time. And we see that Mr. Sinister activates his control over this version of Jean Grey, or the clone, causing her to turn evil, and then all of the X-Men then begin seeing these insane hallucinations. There's some very creepy and scary stuff in this episode. We've got monsters crawling out of the TV like the Ring. We've got terrifying stuffed animals, and whatever this is coming out of the elevator to hunt down Beast. Each one of these hallucinations really plays off each individual character in some sort of way, and this just showed me immediately that Mr. Sinister is not one to mess with. Meline Prior takes the baby back to Mr. Sinister, and the group is completely flustered. They find out that Mr. Sinister is the one behind this due to something with the real Jean, so naturally they go to try and get Nathan back. The only problem is they have to go up against Meline Prior, or again, the clone of Jean, so it's a huge challenge. Because Jean Grey is an extremely powerful X-Men, this evil version of her is extremely tough to deal with. Even an Omega level mutant like Magneto is struggling. Luckily, the real Jean Grey comes to, and we get an inside of their head battle between them two, going through their past, all of the different moments in their lives, and convincing this clone of Jean Grey not to be evil. The real Jean Grey is showing her all of these fond memories and all of these crazy visions. This was beautiful to look at. Completely realizing the potential of an animated show in the best possible way. I absolutely adored the visual elements to this episode. They were trippy, they were sometimes scary, but definitely awe-inspiring and beautiful. Jean eventually breaks through to Meline Prior and breaks her out of Mr. Sinister's curse, thus allowing them to save Nathan by temporarily taking out Mr. Sinister, but he kind of just disappears into the background and is very scary. I really love this character. I love horror, and this dude is doing it for me, giving me the superhero, the scary, all of it together. The only issue is that in saving Nathan Summers from Mr. Sinister's vat, he actually contracted a biotechnic disease. There seems to be no hope for Nathan, but Bishop, being a time traveler, says that possibly in the future there is a cure for him. In a very gut-wrenching moment, Meline Prior has to give up her child even though they just technically met. I couldn't imagine how tough this is for her, and they really convey it super well in the animation. Nonetheless, Bishop takes baby Nathan to the future to hopefully find a cure, and Meline Prior assumes her actual identity, now not being controlled by Mr. Sinister. She adopts her signature name, and at the very end of this episode, we see Storm potentially going on a path to get her powers back. Overall, I thought this was a great episode. Continuing the plot forward, but also being that old school style serialized TV cartoon show where every episode in itself is kind of contained. We have a plot that pretty much gets complete resolution in this episode while setting things up in the future as well. And I can't talk enough about how beautiful and honestly terrifying this episode was. Taking these characters that we're just being introduced to for the first time and already developing these connections with them and these majorly impressive visual elements, I just am in shock at how good this show is. Let me know what you guys thought about this episode down below and your thoughts overall on X-Men 97. I can't wait to cover this show even more. I'm not going to go into too much about the theories of what's going to happen next because it seems like a lot of it is going to be pulling from the comics. So if you know what's going to happen or you think you might know what's going to happen, leave a comment, hit like, subscribe, and I will see you all very soon.